Hi, my name is Holly. I'm a program manager here at Edison Ford Winter Estates. Actually, a museum manager. And I'm in front of a flag at Fort McHenry, which I hope this will inspire you to go visit after this digital discussion is done. Oh, say, can you see the story of Fort McHenry and the Star-Spangled Banner? And this is a modern picture, a reenactment. At the start of the 19th century, Great Britain was locked in a long and hostile conflict with France, which was led by Napoleon Bonaparte. To stop supplies from reaching the enemy, both sides tried to block the United States from trading with the other. In 1807, Great Britain passed the Orders in Council, which required neutral countries to obtain a license from its authorities before trading with the French or French colonies. And the Royal Navy was infuriating Americans at that time, Great Britain was, because it was practicing impressment, which means it would go to a U.S. merchant vessel and it would remove sailors from there. And they were forced to serve on behalf of Great Britain. During the War of 1812, the U.S. is going to take on the greatest naval power in the world. And that wasn't us, that was Great Britain. And this conflict is going to have an immense impact on the United States' future. The U.S. goes to war against Great Britain, and we were the aggressors because we felt we were responding to what Great Britain was doing to our sailors. They're already having a war against France, which had been going on since 1793. Canada, that was then under British rule, became the primary battleground between the United States and the United Kingdom. So why was this war fought? Because we're talking about the battle, but we need to know a little bit about the war. And I will be honest that I could definitely stand to learn some more. So that was my goal, to share a little more that I've learned with you and to inspire you and myself to keep on reading. I definitely knew why the war started, and I know about the Battle of Fort McHenry, but there's always so many details that are left out. So just a few points here. The War of 1812 was fought between the United States and Great Britain, 1812 to 1815. There were multiple reasons why it was fought. Neither side was prepared for war, and President Madison believed we could easily capture Canada. That was wrong. It was only 29 years after we had fought for our independence in the Revolutionary War. And James Madison sends a list of grievances to Congress, and they granted a declaration of war, and he signs it. And the war is going to last 2 years and 8 months. I told you about them taking soldiers and making them serve for Great Britain. We were also restricted from trading with France because they had an ongoing war with them. And this all comes down to also something I'm sure you've heard before called manifest destiny, that it was our right and our duty to seize things, even if they didn't belong to us. The British were supporting the Native American Indians in the Northwest Territory. And at that time, the U.S. believed it was our duty to go and capture those lands. Let's go west. Madison thought that, and even before Madison did, Thomas Jefferson did as well. Anything was ours to take. A lot of people didn't want to go to war, but a lot of people did. Do you know how many U.S. military people they had at that time? 12,000. That's not very many to fight a war with. The president thought we could go right up there, up north, and we could easily capture Canada. 7,000 U.S. soldiers go there. They're not trained. The invasion, it was led poorly. It was very self-serving. And the invasion was a complete failure. And with only a few months, the British pushed Americans back. And that was the start of Michigan Territory. The War of 1812 is what's going to inspire the Star-Spangled Banner. You'll find out about that in a minute. A lot of well-known people served in the war, but I will have to say that this is probably one of the wars that people know about the least. There's the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, and this one is kind of overlooked. And you probably also have heard about the song about Colonel Jackson, Andrew Jackson, that takes place during the War of 1812. I think it's actually in the Battle of New Orleans is 1815, and it starts out in 1814. We took a little trip down to Colonel Jackson to the mighty Mississippi. It's something like that. You get the idea. Well, we didn't capture Canada, but Great Britain's going to do something about what we've done to them. Let's see what happens. This is what happens. This is an illustration from an 1816 book, The History of England. And this is Washington, D.C. The British are going to burn down our United States Capitol. They want retribution for what we did in Canada. And this is, I believe, the Battle of Blandisburg. This is going to lean up to Washington, D.C. being captured. But this is the battle that focuses on the Star-Spangled Banner. Let me tell you a little bit before that. There's a Battle of Blandisburg, and British General Robert Ross captured the nation's capital right after that, and he burned down the essential centers of government. I'll talk more about that in a minute. They set the city on fire. Following their overwhelming victory at Blandisburg, the British troops burned the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. Due to their success, the British commanders now had their eyes set on the third largest city in the United States, the city of Baltimore. The battle that followed combined naval and land assault against the United States forces around the city. And this is a picture of the White House ruins depicted in a watercolor painting. And there's another one, and this is the U.S. Capitol. And this is what's so amazing to me. The U.S. Capitol at that time contained the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the Library of Congress. They did not allow private residence to be burned. There's another view. A couple things I want to say. The Battle of Blandisburg makes it possible. They easily defeated the Americans. It was 3 hours of intense fighting. This is in Maryland. And the Americans weren't ready. They were poorly trained. They didn't have, their lines weren't positioned so they could support each other. The British stormed the bridge, and after one failed attempt, crossed the river, pushed the Americans back. On it goes. So this is going to give them a clear path to Washington, D.C. And I'm just going to go back a little bit here so you can look at D.C. burning. President Madison's out of there. They're on the field of battle, and then they are going to Washington, getting out of the city itself, trying to be safely away. He sends a message to his wife, Dolly Madison, to save what possessions they can and flee. And yes, they do save the picture of George Washington. Dolly did not climb up and cut it out of the frame. They wouldn't have had time to do that. She does direct the enslaved to take down that painting along with some other things. But the Capitol is destroyed. The president, the White House, the Navy Yard, this is retaliation for the American action when the British, they try to capture against the British Upper Canada. Will be the Ontario, Toronto area today. And they did some burning and looting themselves. So now our capital is gone. The British soldiers moved in there and they burned the city. And Washington's naval yard was ordered to be set ablaze to prevent the warships from being taken into British hands. So we set on fire our own naval area. British Admiral George Cockburn ordered his men to burn the city, the Treasury, and other government buildings. Don't destroy private residences. And they even spared the patent office due to the head administrator convincing the British that inside the building there was private property, and they didn't burn that. But do you know what happened? Excuse me, after the fact, guess what? So private residents are spared. The next day, a storm goes into Washington, D.C., puts out the fires. But during the storm, a tornado erupted and tore through the city. The tornado did not spare the private residences, and then they were destroyed. So Washington is a wasteland, and there were many, many looters throughout the city, and a lot of them were American citizens, unfortunately. So the British are now finished burning Washington, and they all head towards the next most important place, this big seaport, Baltimore. And by the way, the capital had been the capital for about 12 years at that point. So this map is from the National Park Service, and it shows in detail the defenses around Baltimore, including entrenchments at Hampstead Hill and Fort McHenry. Maryland had its defenses prepared. The governor had their defenses prepared more than a year before the British soldiers arrived in Maryland. The harbor was fortified by chains and sunken hulls, and additional, more powerful guns were placed at Fort McHenry. Citizens of Baltimore constructed a 2.5-mile-long redoubt called Hampstead Hill, and that's what you'll see on the map, with 100 cannons that guarded the eastern approach to the city. So what I will say is I don't think D.C. was prepared. Baltimore is. And during the Revolutionary War, a small earthen-shaped fort known as Fort Whetstone was built at the end of the peninsula that led to the entrance of Baltimore Harbor. Although the fort was never attacked during the American Revolution, military experts saw the importance of coastal defenses around the newly formed United States' third largest city and one of its essential ports. So construction began in 1798 to expand Fort Whetstone into a new, more permanent masonry structure with brick and stone. The new fort was named Fort McHenry after George Washington's Secretary of War and Baltimore Navy. Fort McHenry. And I'm sure I've heard this when I was in Baltimore at Fort McHenry, but I didn't remember it. Originally meant to cause a delay, the Battle of North Point on September 12th. So remember, D.C. is in August. This is September 12th, became one of the most pivotal events in the Battle of Baltimore. A small detachment of American troops left the defenses north of Baltimore and marched directly towards the better trained and greater numbered enemy. And that's from the National Park Service. While the battle was a British victory, it had several important effects. It slowed British landing forces advancing on Baltimore. It had a significant impact on boosting the United States morale and resulted in a greater number of British casualties, including one that was devastating to the British, and that was the death of their commander, Major General Robert Ross. In September of 1814, 5,000 British soldiers landed northeast of the city and stopped outside the quickly constructed earthworks. The British needed to come into the harbor to support the attack. Standing in their way was Fort McHenry, and it had 1,000 defenders. And there are some soldiers that aren't at Fort McHenry on the road as well. On September 13th, 1814, and you're going to hear this again, the most powerful Navy in the world, the British Navy, that's what was most powerful at that time, sent a force of bomb and rocket ships to dislodge the defenders from their fortifications. And I'm going to repeat this again, but I liked this picture. So they unleashed a torrent of shells and rockets onto Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor, and they pounded the American fort for 25 hours, The bombardment was known as the Battle of Baltimore, and it was just weeks after they had burnt D.C., the Capitol, the Treasury, and the White House, which was called the President's House. It's another part of that saga of the War of 1812. And this is called A View of the Bombardment of Fort McHenry. The print was by J. Bauer of Philadelphia, 1816. One of the soldiers who was in the fort during the 25-hour bombardment wrote, "We were like pigeons tied by the legs to be shot at." Let me just go back for a second because I want to tell you a little more. Who is the commander at Fort McHenry itself? That is Major George Armstead. British warships had begun their bombardment. Because of the shallow water, the British are unable to use their heavy warships and instead attack with bomb vessels, HMS Terra, Volcano, Meteor, and Devastation, and Etna. And they fire exploding mortar shells at high angles. That's what you're seeing there, going into the fort. The rocket ship HM Erebus, which launches the newly invented Congreve rockets, the ammunition used by those ships, which inspired Francis Scott Key's famous line, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air. Initially, the British fleet exchanged fire with the fort's cannon, but soon withdraw out of range. For the next 25 hours, the fort is mostly just having to take it. In the driving rain, the warships hammered the fort. More than 1,500 cannonballs, shells, and rockets are fired. But they only inflict light damage, believe it or not, thanks to the fortification efforts completed before the battle. During the night, Cochrane orders a landing party to slip past the fort and attempt to draw troops from the force opposing Brooke, but other than the diverting some fire from the fort, this was unsuccessful. September 14th, what's going to happen? The American defenders lowered their battered storm flag that was flying and raised the large 30 by 42-foot garrison flag that Major Armistead ordered a year earlier from local flag maker Mary Pickersgill. The garrison flag is raised every morning at Reveille, but on this day, September 14th, its presence has special significance. And I'll get back to this. I just wanted to fill in a couple of the pieces. Now, I realized that they were in a fort, so it was easier to protect than a whole city in Washington, D.C. But I just still feel like a little more preparation maybe could have helped a little bit. But of course, they had the tornado that couldn't be helped. Fort McHenry was the last line of defense for Baltimore. If the fort was seized, then Baltimore would fall as well. The capture of Baltimore would mean the new country of the U.S. would lose two major coastal cities. On a merchant ship in the harbor was American prisoner exchange agent Colonel John Stuart Skinner and Georgetown lawyer Francis Scott Key. On September 5th, Stuart and Key sailed into the harbor to meet with the British to discuss the release of Dr. William Beans. Beans was a doctor and a colleague of Key who had refused to give food and drink to the British soldiers who had come to his house in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. He was scheduled to be hanged. They're not going to tolerate that. At first, General Ross was unwilling to reach the doctor, but when letters from the wounded Englishmen praising the medical treatment from the doctor, they agreed to let him go because he had helped the British with their wounding. However, the doctor and the men of the party were detained to prevent them from reporting the British plans to attack Baltimore. As the British fleet traveled north, the three Americans were transferred to the HM frigate Surprise and their truce boat and crew towed behind. And that's from the National Park Service, that little part there. Before the battle began, Key, Skinner, and Dr. Beans were returned to their truce boat, but kept under guard. There they found themselves very close observers of the Battle of Baltimore. So Key, Francis Scott Key, saved his friend's life. He got those letters of support that showed what he had done for the British troops, but he wasn't going to give them food and drink. And of course, during that time period, we don't have photography, so there's a painting of Francis Scott Key. Let's hear what he has to say. He said, "It seems as though Mother Earth had opened and was vomiting shot and shell in a sheet of fire and brimstone," Key later wrote. But when darkness came, all he could see was red exploding over the night sky. Due to the size of the attack, he was sure that the British would win. As the hours passed, he saw in the clearing smoke the American flag, not the British Union Jack, that was flying over the fort. And you can see him looking at the flag there, and it proclaimed that the Americans were victorious. And there's Key's writing right there. He wrote down his thoughts while still on board the ship, setting his words to a popular English drinking song called "To Anacreon in Heaven." His brother-in-law, commander of a militia at Fort McHenry, read his writing and had it distributed under the name Defense of Fort McHenry. The Baltimore paper published it, and Key's poem, now called the Star-Spangled Banner, appeared in papers across the country. The song remained popular throughout the 19th century, and I didn't put that on here, but particularly in the South, and emerged as a symbol of unity during the Civil War. The Star-Spangled Banner became the U.S.'s official national anthem in 1931. And something interesting I didn't put on here, but I talked about how did Star-Spangled Banner become played at sports events, starting with baseball, because it's probably our oldest sport. And what happened was that the Boston Red Sox, my beloved team, they were called the Boston Americans at the time, and they had a band there or something to commemorate, that they're playing the game. And so they started playing the Star-Spangled Banner. They were the Boston Americans. And then the other side started playing some kind of Irish tune. Anyway, I thought that was a kind of fun connection. The men of the fort were out in the open. There were no bomb-proof shelters to protect the soldiers during the attack. A moat of about 3 to 4 feet deep that surrounded the fort was the only place that offered any type of protection, and it wasn't much. On the outside of the fort were 2 water batteries, an upper and lower battery. Each battery had 20 French naval cannons of various sizes, 18, 24, and 36 pounders. Each one could fire a solid iron ball or shot at the rate of 1,800 feet per second, or close to 1.5 miles. And this is from the U.S. National Park Service. And I told you more. I told you about their commander. I told you what was going on at that time. So the battle rages on. The ships are out there in the harbor. They move beyond the range of the people at the fort. So the fort had to endure while they were being attacked for 25 hours because they couldn't shoot and land on the British ships because the British ships had backed out. And while it does damage, it doesn't do the kind of damage one would think from 25 hours of a bombardment. The Americans had assembled 10,000 men and 100 cannon across the Philadelphia Road, blocking the British advance towards Baltimore. The British were outnumbered 2 to 1. They turned their focus to Fort McHenry and the naval support now. We're not going to deal with those soldiers. Major George Armistead, and I'm going to tell you about a connection to his name later on, commanded the 1,000 men at Fort McHenry. In the early morning, the ships began bombarding due to the shallow water. Admiral Cochrane was unable to use the heavy warships and instead attacked with 5 bomb vessels. These ships fire exploding mortar shells at high angles into the fort. At first, the British exchanged fire with the force cannon, but soon withdrew out of range, which I told you about. So for 25 hours, it's in the driving range. Rain, 1,500 cannonballs, shells, and rockets are fired, but it only inflicts slight damage. September 14th, that morning, the American defenders lowered their battered storm flag and raised the large 30 by 42 foot garrison flag that Major Armistead had ordered 1 year before from local flag maker Mary Pickersgill. The garrison flag is raised every morning at reveille. I can't get them, da 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 da. And its presence on this day has special significance. They had triumphed. They had beat the British. The U.S. had 4 killed and 24 wounded, 0 missing and captured. The U.K., Great Britain had 1 wounded and 0 missing and captured. And this is from the National Park Service site. And this is a statue of Francis Scott Key in Baltimore. And this is what it says. And I will leave it up to you to determine what you think about Francis Scott Key. Francis Scott Key had a conflicted relationship with slavery. He defended enslaved individuals. He's a lawyer, seeking their freedom as an attorney, and believed that by the law of nature, all men are free. The presumption is that even Black men and Africans are slaves is not a universal presumption. Okay, that's what he writes. But just like, unfortunately, many people of that time that believed enslavement was wrong, they still practiced it or defended it. He chose to take part in it. He purchased his first enslaved person in 1800 or 1801, and by 1820, he owned 6 enslaved people. His family owned enslaved at the time of his birth, and at least one of his children owned enslaved after his death. He defended other slave owners seeking to regain runaway property as an attorney, and he vehemently opposed abolition and favored the idea of colonization, helping to establish the American Colonization Society in 1816. Key manumitted or freed several slaves. Those manumissions may have been rooted in profit. However, as the enslaved individuals he manumitted were of advanced age and may not have been able to provide a level of free labor that Key felt justified the cost of feeding and housing them. He signed a manumission for 2 enslaved boys named Joe and John, who were 2 years and 6 months of age, but stipulated they would not be manumitted until they attained the age of 25. Both the Star-Spangled Banner and the song written about it are chained to the institution of slavery. Key defended and participated in the institution of slavery. And his personal ownership of other human beings stands opposed to his definition of the United States as the land of the free. The 3rd verse of the song mentions, "No refuge could save the hireling and slave." It's not clear what Key intended this line to mean, and he could have been referring to the foreign troops serving with the British or the enslaved men that comprised the British colonial Marines. And remember, they would seize the enslaved and put them on British ships, or it could just be a reflection of his views at that time period. I don't know the answer. And I'm sure most of us have never sang or heard the 2nd, 3rd, 4th verses of that song. But now you know what was happening. And one thing I didn't mention, and this frequently happened during the War of 1812, is that enslaved people would also make their way to British ships to escape being enslaved. Anyway, I like to include things that are from the National Park Service so you'll know what their view is on this. Major General, that picture is from the 1960s, by the way. You can tell from the look of it. And this is about the flag. Major George Armistead, the commander of Fort McHenry, knew that his fort would be a British target. He told the commanders of Baltimore's defenses they needed a large flag. We, sir, are ready at Fort McHenry to defend Baltimore against invading by the enemy, except that we have no suitable ensign flag to display over the Star Fort. And it is my desire to have a flag so large that the British will have no difficulty seeing it from a distance. And thank goodness that does happen. Armistead hired a 37-year-old widow and a professional flag maker, Mary Pickersgill, to make a 30 by 42-foot garrison flag with 15 stars and 15 stripes. Over the next 6 weeks, Mary, her daughter, two of her nieces, a 13-year-old indentured servant, and her mother, and some enslaved, used 300 yards of English wool bunting to sew the flag. They made the stars, each measuring 2 feet in diameter, from cotton, which was a luxury at the time. They worked at Mary's house until they outgrew it, and then they moved to a brewery across the street. For making the Star-Spangled Banner, Pickersgill was paid $405.90. That's almost $8,000 today. She received another $168.54, around $3,300, for sewing a smaller 17 by 25-foot storm flag using the same Star-Spangled Banner that flew during the battle. The garrison flag, that's a 30 by 42, according to eyewitnesses, was not raised until the morning of September 14th, 1814. The garrison flag, listen to this, weighed 50 pounds and took 9 men to hoist over Fort McHenry. And what do we know about Pickersgill? Mary Pickersgill also owned slaves who were involved in supporting the creation of the flag, and I would say enslaved. An indentured servant named Grace Wisher sewed much of the banner by hand. And this is Mary Pickersgill, 40 years later. And so you've already heard about her, but I want to tell you what happens to the flag after that. And there's the only picture that I've ever seen of Mary Pickersgill. Armistead was in command of the Fort McHenry for the rest of his short life. He died at the age of 38. After the death of Armistead's widow in 1861, the Star-Spangled Banner was left to his daughter, Georgina Armistead Appleton, who recognized that it held national as well as family significance. A couple of points here. Number one, we don't know how he actually acquired the flag. Did he just take it down and keep it? There's no answer to that. His widow did something interesting. She started to give away little pieces of the flag to different people. And one of the stars went missing, and some other small pieces. And they never did find one of the stars. So there were only actually 14 stars to put back together, but little pieces as souvenirs. That wasn't anything unusual to happen. That was kind of a thing that people used to do. Anyways, his daughter allows the flag to be publicly shown on several occasions. Eben Appleton, Armistead's grandson, inherited the flag in 1878 from his mother. With the public wanting to know more about the Star-Spangled Banner, he began to look for a suitable place for it to be. In 1907, he lent the flag to the Smithsonian Museum of American History, and in 1912, he offered the flag as a permanent gift to the nation. Excuse me for 1 minute. In 1914, the Smithsonian hired Amelia Fowler, a well-known flag restorer. Collaborating with a crew of 10 needlewomen, Fowler first removed a canvas backing that had been attached to the flag in 1873 when it was displayed and photographed for the first time at the Boston Navy Yard by Admiral George Preble. The woman then attached the flag to a new linen backing, sewing approximately 1,700,000 interlocking stitches to form a honeycomb-like mesh over the flag's surface. It took Fowler and her crew 8 weeks. They keep on messing with the flag. I don't know if this did any favors. And there she is. For the next 50 years, and this is from the Smithsonian's website, apart from a brief move during World War II for safety reasons, the Star-Spangled Banner was displayed in what is now the Arts and Industry Building. The glass case holding the flag wasn't long enough to display the entire piece of fabric, so its lower half was folded up. It was only in 1964, and this is a modern picture, by the way, that the public was able to view the flag in its entirety. That year, the flag became the centerpiece of the new National Museum of History and Technology, now the National Museum of American History, which had ample space to allow the National Treasury to hang freely. The Star-Spangled Banner remained in Flag Hall until 1998, when it was taken down to undergo extensive conservation. Started in 1996, the Star-Spangled Banner Preservation Project was planned with the help of historians, conservators, curators, engineers, and organic scientists. Conservators began working on the flag in 1999 when a construction of a conservation lab at the museum was completed. Over the next several years, they clipped 1.7 million stitches from the flag. Remember all that honeycomb effect? To remove the linen backing that had been added in 1914, lifted debris using dry cosmetic sponges, and brushed the flag with an acetone water mixture to remove soils embedded in the fibers. Finally, they added a sheer polyester backing to help support the flag. Our goal was to extend the flag's usable lifetime, said Thomas and Krause. The intent was never to make the flag look as it did when it first flew over Fort McHenry. We didn't want to change any of the history written on the artifact by stains and soil, the conservator added. Those marks tell the flag's story. While the conservators worked, the public looked on. By 2006, when the National Museum of American History closed for a 2-year renovation, more than 12 million people had peered into the museum's conservation glass lab to observe the process. The National Museum of American History reopened in November 2008 with the Star-Spangled Banner now displayed in its own climate control gallery. And there it is. And yes, I have been there to see the flag as it was being conserved. And I guess I didn't mention visiting Fort McHenry myself several times. It's been quite a while since I've been there, but I found it to be one of the most moving experiences of my life. They show a little film, and then they open the curtains or the blinds, and you look out and you see not the original Star-Spangled Banner, but you see the Star-Spangled Banner. And that always touches my heart, and I get a lump in my throat and tears in my eyes. Key wrote down his thoughts while still on board the ship. I told you that. And this is all something that you've heard. It was a unifier during the Civil War, and it doesn't become our national anthem till 1931. There was a lot of push to make this our national anthem. I think the other contender was America the Beautiful. And this one actually shows 3 verses of the four. And there's actually a 5th verse, but here it is in its entirety. And I have to be honest, beyond the first verse, I know none of the words. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. And of course, not everyone was free at that time. And there is the verse the chorus. That's verse 3. And where's that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country should leave us no more? Their blood is washed out, their foul footsteps pollution. No refuge could save the hiring and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of grave. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. And I will leave it up to you. I've told you the background of that verse for you to speculate on what you think Francis Scott Key was referring to. During the Civil War, I told you it became very popular symbol of patriotism for both the North and the South. On the 4th of July in 1861, the first year of the war, physician and writer Oliver Wendell Holmes penned additional lyrics that became an unofficial verse. Holmes wrote of millions unchained who our birthright have gained as he looked ahead to a time when the U.S. would fulfill its ideals by ending slavery and creating a truly equal society. Meanwhile, the South claimed Francis Scott Key as a Southern slaveholder. Holmes' version circulated widely during the Civil War, especially in Northern newspapers. Of course, today it's not remembered. Nothing is beyond that first verse. When our land is illumined with liberty's smile, if a foe from within strike a blow at her glory, down, down with the traitor that dares to defile the flag of her stars and the page of her story. By the millions unchained who our birthright have gained, we will keep her bright blazoned forever unstained, and the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph shall wave, while the land of the free is the home of the brave. In 1889, the U.S. Navy recognized the Star-Spangled Banner as the official tune for raising and lowering the flag. Woodrow Wilson decreed the national anthem of the armed forces in 1916. Famed band leader John Philip Sousa. When I was a child, we had a whole album of just John Philip Sousa marches. And conductor Walter Dermosh assisted in preparing an official arrangement for the use of by the Army and Navy that went into circulation in 1917. And finally, the Star-Spangled Banner became the official national anthem under Herbert Hoover on March 3rd, 1931. And there's Oliver Wendell Holmes, and there's his verse. That was 47 years after the War of 1812. And there he is as a young man. And this is a picture that was taken at the Boston Navy Yard, and look how they are displaying it. It was taken in 1873, so probably the earliest picture of that, by George Henry Preble of the flag that flew over Fort McHenry on the morning of September 14th, 1814. So, totally off the subject, but something interesting is connections, family connections. We have two people here. Have you ever heard of Union General George Sickles? Well, he is the first man that ever took the insanity defense when he was a congressman. Why did that happen? Well, he found out his wife, Teresa, was having an affair with the son of Francis Scott Key. He was not happy, and he shot him in cold blood, successfully used the insanity defense. He does, I think his son's name is Baron Key. He does take his wife back. He was not thought highly of for that reason. His wife does stay with the Sickles. She is shunned by society. Sickles literally got away with murder. He killed Baron Key, Francis Scott Key's son. And then he goes on to fight and become a general in the Civil War, where he leaves, doesn't like the position that he has, moves his troops, leaves this big gap for people to pile in through, did not follow orders well, lost a leg, and used to go visit it when it was on display at a medical government museum. But anyways, that's him, Major Dan Sickles at Philip Barton Key. He is shooting Philip Barton Key there. Who's the other man? That is Lewis Armistead, nephew of the commander of the Fort McHenry. And Lewis Armistead was in the military, very good friends with General Hancock, a Union general. They had served together during the Mexican War, and Lewis Armistead will go on to fight for the Confederacy. He will be on the field at Gettysburg at Pickett's Charge and will reach what is called the high water mark of the Confederacy. They walk over that field, Pickett's Charge, a mile long. He puts his hand on a cannon. He is shot and will die 2 days later. He is helped by a fellow Mason when he does the Mason distress call. And he tells that person, who's a Union soldier, who was an aide to General Hancock, to tell him that he had done a grave disservice. And then also Mrs. Hancock had his personal possessions that she would take care of and get to his family. And he had found out that Hancock had also been shot. Hancock, his dear friend, the Union general, survived the war, but he was never the same. He had wounds in this area of his body that sit on the saddle. So that's just a little aside of some trivia. So in conclusion, what I will say is go visit Fort McHenry, hear the story. Hear the story of Armistead, the commander of the fort, the British, Francis Scott Key. Go visit it. It's a piece of history. It's a war that doesn't get enough attention. Of course, wars are terrible things, but it's important to know our U.S. history. And I hope this will inspire you to read more and learn more. And here are my sources. And there's a couple of very interesting books. This is a cultural biography, so it's about its place in society. It's called Oh Say Can You Hear? And then there's one called Through the Perilous Fight, 6 Weeks That Changed the Nation. I urge you to read them. Go to the National Park Service, go to the Smithsonian, learn more about this story. Thank you for joining me. You've been a great group of listeners. I'll see you next month. Thank you.